I renew to you all today. Alongside the personal grief that all my family are feeling, we also share with so many of you.
On the last day of August 1997, the world woke up to news that seemed impossible. Diana, Princess of Wales, was dead, killed in a car crash in a Paris underpass at just 36 years old. Amid the grief that swept across Britain and the world, few people were thinking about paperwork. But tucked away in a solicitor's office was a document that would go on to cause years of quiet controversy inside the royal family. Diana's last will and testament. What it actually contained, and what happened to it after her death, is stranger, sadder, and more revealing than almost anyone expected. This is a story about a secret clause discovered decades later in a locked archive. That version has circulated online in various forms, but it isn't real. The true story doesn't need embellishment. What actually happened to Diana's will, the choices she made, the fight that broke out over her final wishes, and what it tells us about a mother trying to protect two young sons from a life she knew would be difficult, is documented in probate records, court filings, and the recollections of people who were there. This is that story. Diana signed her will on June 1, 1993. To understand why the document reads the way it does, you have to understand what her life looked like at that moment. Her marriage to Prince Charles had effectively ended the year before, when the couple formally separated following years of tabloid speculation and private unhappiness. Diana was 31 years old, raising two young boys, William and Harry, largely on her own inside the strange, scrutinized world of the royal family. Her own father, Earl Spencer, had died the previous year, leaving her an inheritance of roughly £5 million. That inheritance became the foundation of the will she wrote. Royal historians who have studied the document describe it as surprisingly ordinary, even a little rushed. It wasn't drafted with the elaborate legal architecture you might expect from someone in Diana's position. Instead, it followed a fairly standard structure. She named her mother, Frances Shan Kidd, and her sister, Lady Sarah McCorquodale, as her executors. She left the bulk of her estate to be split between William and Harry. She left £50,000 to Paul Burrell, her butler and one of her most trusted staff members. She left mementos to her 17 godchildren, and she attached something called a letter of wishes, a supplementary, non-binding note that laid out how she wanted her personal belongings distributed, including instructions that 3/4 of her jewelry and personal items go to her sons, with the remaining quarter shared among her godchildren. At the time she wrote it, Diana had no way of knowing her divorce settlement was still years away, or that she would receive a payout of roughly £16 million from Charles as part of it in 1996. She never went back and updated the will to reflect that new wealth. When she died just a year later, that omission would matter more than anyone anticipated. When the High Court of Justice formally valued Diana's estate after her death, the figure came out to £21,711,485, a sum that, adjusted for the currency of the time, was worth somewhere around $30 to $33 million US dollars. It was an extraordinary amount of money for a single individual, royal or not. But it wasn't a simple inheritance. Once inheritance tax was applied, the estate's value dropped sharply, down to roughly £12 to £17 million, depending on how various assets were finally assessed. There was a further complication that many people don't realize. Under UK inheritance law at the time, if a person dies within a certain window after a divorce settlement is finalized, the other party can, in some circumstances, reclaim part of that settlement rather than have it taxed as part of the estate. Charles had the legal standing to potentially claim back the £16 million divorce settlement he had paid Diana, which would have meant William and Harry's inheritance was taxed only on the smaller sum Diana had inherited from her own father. He did not do this. The full settlement remained part of Diana's taxable estate, and as a result, William and Harry's eventual inheritance was reduced by nearly half once the tax bill was settled. Diana's original will specified that William and Harry would each receive their full share of the inheritance when they turned 25. But in the months following her death, her executors, her own mother and sister, the people she had trusted most to carry out her wishes, went to probate court and requested what's known as a variation of the will. The court granted it. The variation pushed back the age at which the princes could access the bulk of their inheritance from 25 to 30, although they were permitted to receive income generated by the trust starting at 25. It also altered what her godchildren were entitled to. Diana's letter of wishes had asked that a quarter of her personal property, clothing, personal items, keepsakes, be split among her 17 godchildren. Under the variation, each godchild instead received a single item, chosen for them by the executors, rather than any meaningful share of the estate. Some later described it, not unkindly, as more of a memento than an inheritance. Here's the part that made the story genuinely controversial. None of this was done publicly, and the families of the minor godchildren affected by the change were not consulted or informed at the time. The variation was handled quietly through the courts in the aftermath of Diana's death, at a moment when the country and the family were consumed by grief and the closest thing the monarchy had seen to a national crisis in a generation. It wasn't until years later, when the change came to light through unrelated legal proceedings, most notably the widely publicized 2002 case against Paul Burrell, who had been accused of stealing items belonging to Diana's estate, that many of these details became widely known and scrutinized by the press. The Burrell trial itself collapsed abruptly in November 2002, after evidence emerged that Queen Elizabeth II had actually spoken with Burrell about the items in question years earlier, undermining the entire case against him. But the trial's messy unraveling opened a door that the palace had clearly hoped would stay closed. It shone a spotlight on how Diana's estate and her final wishes had actually been handled, and for the first time, ordinary people, not just royal insiders, began asking pointed questions about who had really controlled Diana's legacy after she was no longer able to speak for herself. Under the revised terms, William received his roughly £10 million share of the estate when he turned 30 in 2012. Harry received his matching share 2 years later, when he turned 30 in 2014. By modern standards, William's overall net worth, bolstered by his royal position, property, and other assets, is now estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Harry's net worth, separate from the institution since he and Meghan Markle stepped back from royal duties in 2020, is estimated at somewhere around $60 million. That inheritance mattered more to Harry's life story than almost any other financial detail associated with the royal family. In his now famous 2021 interview with Oprah Winfrey, conducted shortly after he and Meghan relocated to the United States, Harry was direct about how much his mother's money had shaped his choices. He said plainly that what his mother had left him was what allowed him and Meghan to build an independent life outside the institution. It wasn't hidden or symbolic. It was the literal financial foundation that made his departure from royal duties possible. There's a bitter irony buried in that fact. Diana wrote her will in 1993, years before either of her sons was old enough to imagine a life outside the palace walls. She could not have known that one day, the money she left behind would help her younger son walk away from the very institution she had spent so much of her adult life trying to survive inside of. But in hindsight, many royal commentators have pointed out that there's something almost fitting about it, as though the inheritance ended up serving a purpose Diana might have quietly hoped for, even if she never could have predicted the exact circumstances. Some of the most symbolically loaded items in Diana's estate weren't distributed until years after her death, tied to the same delayed timeline set by the court variation. Her wedding dress, the elaborate gown with its record-setting 25-foot train, designed by David and Elizabeth Emanuel, toured the world for years as part of a public exhibition before it was finally handed over to her sons once Harry turned 30. Her jewelry followed a similar path. Pieces from her collection have since become some of the most recognizable items worn by the next generation of royal women. William gave Diana's sapphire engagement ring to Kate Middleton when he proposed in 2010, and it remains one of the most photographed pieces of jewelry in the modern royal family. Several other pieces from Diana's collection have since been worn publicly by Meghan Markle, including a diamond Cartier bracelet she wore during her own sit-down interview with Oprah. Diana's grave itself sits apart from any of this legal wrangling. She's buried on a small private island within an ornamental lake on the grounds of Althorp, the Spencer family estate in Northamptonshire, where she grew up. Althorp has belonged to the Spencer family since 1508, and under the tradition of male primogeniture that still governs the estate, it will eventually pass to Diana's nephew, Louis Spencer, rather than to William or Harry, despite their being her direct sons. Diana's brother, Charles Spencer, the current Earl, has spoken candidly about how outdated that tradition can feel, even as he continues to follow it. What Althorp does offer William and Harry is something money can't really touch: a quiet, protected place to visit their mother's resting place away from public view. In his 2023 memoir Spare, Harry described bringing Meghan there for the first time on the 25th anniversary of Diana's death, a private moment largely shielded from the kind of scrutiny that defined so much of his mother's life. It's tempting, when telling this story, to reach for the language of conspiracy, secret clauses, buried documents, shocking twists uncovered decades later. But the real story doesn't need that kind of embellishment, and honestly, it's more affecting without it. What actually happened is this: a young mother, in the middle of the most painful period of her adult life, sat down and wrote a will that reflected where she stood at that exact moment, not knowing she had only 4 years left to live, not knowing her financial situation would change dramatically after her divorce, and not knowing that the people she trusted most to carry out her wishes would later go to court to change some of the terms she had set. None of that makes Diana's will shocking, in the sense that internet rumors have sometimes suggested. There was no secret payout tied to reconciliation, no legal trap designed to punish one son over the other, no buried appendix waiting to resurface on a specific birthday. What there was, instead, was a fairly ordinary legal document that became extraordinary simply because of who wrote it and what happened to her sons. Afterward, 2 boys who grew from children into men very much in the public eye, whose relationship with each other has visibly changed over the years in ways that have been documented extensively in interviews, memoirs, and public appearances, entirely separate from anything written in their mother's will. What makes Diana's actual will worth revisiting isn't a hidden twist. It's the human story sitting quietly underneath the legal language. A woman in her early 30s, newly separated, grieving her own father, trying to make sure her 2 sons would be taken care of no matter what happened to her. She couldn't have anticipated the scale of what was coming: the divorce settlement, the public fascination with her every move, the tragedy in Paris just a year later, or the quiet legal battle her own family would wage over her wishes once she was no longer there to speak for herself. The variation of her will, decided in a courtroom without her son's knowledge and without input from the families it affected most, remains one of the more uncomfortable footnotes in the story of Diana's legacy. It's a reminder that even the most carefully laid plans can be reshaped by the people left behind, for reasons that may have felt practical or protective at the time, but that don't always sit easily with the person who wrote the original wishes. William and Harry eventually received what their mother intended for them, even if the timeline and the exact terms shifted along the way. What they've done with that inheritance, and with her memory, has played out very publicly ever since, through charitable work, through very public disagreements, through 2 very different paths forward as adults. None of that needed a secret clause to be dramatic. It was always right there in the public record, waiting for anyone willing to look closely enough. That's the real story of Princess Diana's will, not a document that resurfaced decades later to stun a king and a prince, but one that quietly shaped 2 boys' lives from the moment their mother was gone, in ways the public is still, all these years later, only beginning to fully understand.